This is the Speak Hope podcast, equipping you to share the good news of Jesus more confidently and effectively. For more information, visit us at smbr.org.uk.
Well, welcome back to episode 3 of the Speak Hope podcast. I'm Mark Thomas, and it's such a privilege to be helping you as followers of Christ share the good news with greater confidence and intentionality. If you're listening for the first time, every month we release a new podcast about 15 minutes long with really practical tools to help you share your faith. And as always, if you're finding it helpful, please do share it with your friends and with your churches. Now, last episode we thought about being an encourager, adorning the gospel by speaking words of appreciation and encouragement to the people in my life. To be effective in sharing the good news, we need to make encouragement a way of life, so that I'm sharing my faith with others as someone who is a positive presence in their lives. But I want to remind you again of my number one faith-sharing tool that I'd love every listener to have at their fingertips and use regularly. 3 reasons why you personally are glad you're a Christian. And this time I want you to hear from my friend Sammy. Sammy is actually a great encourager. He also works on our facilities team, and he loves talking about Jesus with the people who come in and out of our church building during the week. So this is Sammy on why he's glad to be a Christian.
Hi, I'm Sammy. I've been a Christian for 8 years, going on 9 years now. It still feels new to me. I would like to say the first reason why I am glad to be a Christian is that I'm loved by God, and I really do know that. With that knowledge has allowed me in my life just to drop so many insecurities, because I know I had my guard up a lot of the time, and I can just be happy with the person that I am, and that is, it's really freeing, and it's just made a massive difference in my life, and I'm really happy with the person that I am today, and I'm really excited about the person that I'm becoming. The second reason that I'm glad to be a Christian is the purpose that I have in my life. I know there are many purposes that I do have, but one of those purposes is being a father and helping my children to grow and giving them a safe place and just being with them. And that is what God does for me. And being able to do that for my own children is just, I just love it, and it's so great. The third reason I would say I'm glad to be a Christian is my relationships are so much more deeper and I would say richer becoming a Christian, and with my Christian friends there's a fearlessness, vulnerability that I can have with them, but that is not exclusive just to my Christian friends. I would say that has gone over to anyone really, because I would say daily I get to witness my own failings and my imperfections, and that allows me a lot more patience, I would say, with people around me, to instead of treating them with contempt, I can look at them, you're a human being, and treat them with a lot more, as I said, patience and love, because that's exactly how God treats me.
Well, isn't that great? It's so encouraging to hear why other Christians love God too. And as I said before, that's another reason why it's so great to share and hone those 3 reasons with a small group from your church. Right, let's move on to the core training for today. Now, it's an obvious point to make, but the first step on the road to sharing your faith is to come out as a Christian. To come out as a Christian. At some point, you have to get that simple fact out in the open. Now, it can, of course, be a bit nerve-wracking, but I want to encourage you, have faith for those moments and learn to embrace them. Because when someone finds out you're a Christian, often they're just surprised or intrigued. And it's a perfect opportunity to start sharing not just the fact that you are a Christian, but why you find it to be a wonderful thing. For example, in that moment, you could start off with a bit of your personal story and then finish by explaining why you're glad to be a Christian. And those 3 reasons are, of course, an easy way to do that. But yes, I know many of us still approach that moment with trepidation. We're worried about what assumptions people might jump to about us. Or we're afraid they might ask a really difficult question. By the way, in episode 5, we're going to be thinking practically about how to handle those harder questions that may come our way. But for now, I just want to remind you what I said in episode 1. If people immediately ask a hard question when they find out you're a Christian, it's perfectly fair to say, yes, by all means, let's talk about that at some point. But why don't I tell you first why I am a Christian and why I'm also glad to be one? And I would say this is actually really important for 2 reasons. First, because you want to fill in the bigger picture about yourself. They need to realise you're a person with a life and a story, and not simply a set of opinions on legs. And then second, you need to give yourself a chance to explore their story and their experience. And one vital question that you will almost certainly want to explore before you start debating any issue is this: what's their experience of church? What's their experience of church? So always give yourself the chance to fill in the picture, both about yourself and about them, before you start exploring the big questions. And by the way, when I ask people about their experience, I also like to ask a second question, which is this: in your experience of church, if you have one, did you ever hear anything you could have called good news? Did you ever hear anything you could have called good news? And I ask that because it's the best test I know of whether they've encountered authentic Christianity or not. Because gospel literally means good news. So if they haven't heard any good news, what message is it that they've been hearing? Okay, so those are some tips on how to handle those key moments when people first find out you're a Christian. And remember, those moments are the first stepping stone towards you sharing with them the best news in the whole world. So don't be afraid. Be prepared and ask God to grow your confidence and excitement for those moments. Now, once people know you're a Christian, one of the ways that your faith will keep coming up is through that most common of questions: what did you do over the weekend? And it's such a common question that it's worth being prepared for those moments too. A Bible verse I think is very helpful here is Colossians chapter 4 verse 5, which says this: "Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity." Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. And it's particularly that phrase, make the most of every opportunity, I want to draw to your attention, because that is a key principle for any Christian who wants to grow in sharing their faith. To grow, we need to learn how to make the most of the opportunities God gives us. Okay, so what does that actually mean? Well, first, think about this. When someone asks you about your weekend, what would not making the most of the opportunity look like? What would be not making the most of the opportunity? I suppose one option is that you could make nothing of it. So in your answer, you could mention everything but the fact that you went to church. Another option is to make worse than nothing of it. For example, by saying something actively unhelpful that would discourage them from exploring Christianity. Like, well, I went to church and to be honest, it was awful. I hated it and I never want to go back again. In fact, I think I've decided I'm going to give up my faith. Now, if you're in that kind of place right now, I would definitely discourage you from trying to share your faith. What you need in that situation is to rediscover the good news that it's all about. But there are many better alternatives. Instead of making nothing or making worse than nothing, what would be making something of the opportunity? Something. Well, you could say, yeah, I had a good weekend, thanks. I played football on Saturday, had a great meal in the evening, went for a walk on Sunday, and I also went to church. What about you? Now, in that example, you do actually mention church, which is a great start. I remember one new Christian who was very nervous to tell his mates that he'd started going to church, but he decided he wasn't going to lie to them, and so he told them. And for him, that was a big step forward. He didn't let fear get the better of him. He overcame it. And for some people, simply admitting for the first time that you go to church is a huge step. And if that's you, God knows that, and he's proud of you when you do. But the reason I'd say that's not yet making the most of the opportunity is that answer doesn't open the door to any further conversation, because you immediately move the conversation on. What about you? To make a little bit more of the opportunity, you can say the same thing, but just more confidently and perhaps with a smile. But here's my advice for making the most of the opportunity. And it's as simple as changing your standard answer by one word. Simply one word difference. What's the word? Well, the word is and. and. Instead of saying, I went to church, what about you? You say, I went to church and. You see, if you just say, I went to church, people will immediately fill in the blanks with whatever their experience of church has been, and it's often not very positive. But if you tell them a bit more, you can start to help them understand what your church is like, which may be very, very different. So a better option is to say, I went to church and then either say something positive or something interesting. I went to church and something positive or something interesting. Now, at our church, there's a guy called Rob. He's a sculptor, and he often answers that question by saying, I went to church and I love it. In fact, church is the highlight of my week. And then sometimes he'll add, have you ever been to a church like that? And can you see how that is a much better way to make the most of the opportunity? That kind of positivity is unexpected, and it really intrigues people. So many people will immediately think, wow, that's definitely not my experience of church. What's your church like? So something positive, or you could say something interesting about what you heard that Sunday. And again, this can be really intriguing to people. For example, I went to church yesterday and there was a fascinating talk on why we always end up disappointed in relationships. I went to church and you know what? There was this lady who shared a really powerful story of how her faith had made a difference in her struggle with illness. Or I went to church and it was great. We were thinking about how powerful our words can be. Did you know that the Bible says the tongue has the power of life and death? Or here's one relating to a sermon that I preached recently. So the message was about loving God with all our heart, soul, mind and strength. So when our congregation met people the next day, if they heard my sermon and they were asked about the weekend, one thing they could have said is this. Well, amongst other things, I went to church, and the sermon yesterday was about why Christians don't just believe in God, but love God. We don't just believe in God, but we love God. And you see how that kind of carefully worded summary about your weekend has real potential? Because many people's notion of God is not of a God who is worthy of love, but our God is. And so we want to use opportunities like this to surprise people with good news about God. And do you see how, if you can just pick up on the right thing about church yesterday, then you can really stir people's interest. And perhaps you'll open the door to some very interesting and fruitful conversations. And it's as simple as remembering to add one word to the standard answer. I went to church and. Now, let's have some takeaways for this week. If you want to grow in making the most of the how was your weekend opportunity, first of all, here's a simple exercise to get you started. Once this podcast is over, think about your last 3 weekends, the last 3 weekends. And for each of them, write down something about church that Sunday that might spark someone's interest. Either something positive about the experience or something interesting you heard in a sermon or a testimony or a conversation. And you know what? Even if the preacher was having an off day, that doesn't need to stop you. Why? Well, because it's still possible to have a really interesting thought during a really dull sermon. So even if the preacher fails to draw out the treasures of that Sunday's Bible passage, you can still spot them yourself. And it's an important fact. God's word can still inspire you, even if the preacher doesn't. And I'm quite serious here. If it does, share that instead. Whatever it was that you encountered at church on Sunday, share that. You simply need to say, I went to church yesterday and the sermon got me thinking about this amazing thing, ... So whatever it may be, identify something positive or something interesting from your last 3 Sundays at church. And again, that also could be a great exercise to do with your small group as well. So first, do that exercise. And then second, turn this into a weekly discipline. Get into the habit every week of thinking, what one thing could I say about church today that might be of interest to someone who's not yet a Christian tomorrow? What one thing could I say? You could make it a Sunday evening discipline, you could make it a Monday morning discipline, but just make it a regular discipline to ask yourself that question. And then third, pray. As always, ask God to help you take those opportunities and make the most of those opportunities. Right, let's recap. If we want to grow in sharing our faith, we need to learn to make the most of opportunities. When people first discover we're a Christian, we can make the most of it by sharing why we're glad about that, and then asking them about their experience. And when people ask us what we did at the weekend, well, let's include the fact that we went to church. But more than that, let's tell them something positive or something interesting that went with it. And learning to say, I went to church and. I went to church and. Because those little changes in our mindset and our conversation habits can open the way to all sorts of fascinating conversations. And through them, we can start to help people see why following Jesus is really, really good news. So be prayerful, be courageous, and learn to make the most of these weekly opportunities, which so often prepare the way for the gospel. So speak hope. And as you go, remember, God loves you, He's with you, and He wants to use you this week to bring His good news to a broken world.
Thanks for tuning in to the Speak Hope podcast. For more resources from Mark and the team, do visit us online at smbr.org.uk.